You can count 5 seconds, and then you can start, please, Ale. Hello, thank you very much for being with us during these conversations. This conversation is going to be in English because the other two guests do not speak Spanish. So I will switch to English right now. There will be simultaneous translation into Spanish via Facebook.
I'm going to introduce everybody here first to everybody. Krishani Naidu is director of the
Oh,
Society,
yeah.
Work and Politics Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand. Hope I said that right, in Johannesburg. I'm Alejandra Labastida. I'm curator at MOAC, and I'm also one of the curators, along with Elena Chavez MacGregor, of the exhibition that triggered this academic event. And we are here with Maggie Nelson, who is a writer that defies classification. She works in autobiography, art criticism, theory, feminism, queerness, sexual violence, avant-garde history, aesthetic theory, philosophy, and poetry, among others. She is the author of several books, including Blue X, The Art of Cruelty, The Argonauts, and more recently on freedom. She currently teaches at the University of Southern California and lives in LA. So we kind of like talked about this meeting as a half reading, half conversation format. So we're going to start with Maggie reading some parts of her book, and we're going to take it from there to have a conversation between the three of us. So if you want to go ahead, Maggie.
Sure. One never knows on Zoom who one's talking to, but I greet you. Hello, whoever is there. I'm going to read, I just thought I would bounce around in this book, The Argonauts. It came out in 2015. And I'm really curious to hear what issues about motherhood and maternity have been brought up by the show. And I thought I would just read a bunch of different parts in hopes that I hit on some of the ones that you have talked about. So I'll read about 10 pages scattered throughout the book, and then we can talk. I'm going to make no segues, no connections. I'm just going to jump around. So not long ago, a friend came over to our house and pulled down a mug for coffee, a mug that was a gift from my mother. It's one of those mugs you can purchase online from Snapfish with the photo of your choice emblazoned on it. I was horrified when I received it, but it's the biggest mug we own, so I keep it around in case someone is in the mood for a trough of warm milk or something. Wow, my friend said, filling it up. I've never seen anything so heteronormative in all my life. The photo on the mug depicts my family and me all dressed up to go to the Nutcracker at Christmas time, a ritual that was important to my mother when I was a little girl, and that we have revived with her now that there are children in my life. In the photo, I am 7 months pregnant with what will become my son. I'm wearing a high ponytail and leopard print dress. Harry and his son are wearing matching dark suits, looking dashing. We're standing in front of the mantle at my mother's house, which has monogrammed stockings hanging from it. We look happy. But what about it is the essence of heteronormativity? That my mother made the mug on a bougie service like Snapfish, that we're clearly participating or acquiescing into participating in a long tradition of families being photographed at holiday time and holiday best, that my mother made me the mug in part to indicate that she recognizes and accepts my tribe as family. What about my pregnancy? Is that inherently heteronormative? Or is the presumed opposition of queerness and procreation, or to put a finer edge on it, maternity, more of a reactionary embrace of how things have shaken down for queers, rather than the mark of some ontological truth? As more queers have kids, will the presumed opposition simply wither away? Will you miss it? Is there something inherently queer about pregnancy itself, insofar as it profoundly alters one's normal state and occasions a radical intimacy with and radical alienation from one's body? How can an experience so profoundly strange and wild and transformative also symbolize or enact the ultimate conformity? Or is this just another disqualification of anything tied too closely to the female animal from the privileged term, in this case, nonconformity or radicality? What about the fact that Harry is neither male nor female? I'm a special, a 2-for-1, his character explains in his movie By Hook or by Crook. When or how do, as Judith Butler had it, new kinship systems mime older nuclear family arrangements, end quote, and when or how do they, quote, radically recontextualize them in a way that constitutes a rethinking of kinship, end quote? How can you tell? Or rather, who is to tell? Tell your girlfriend to find a different kid to play house with, your ex would say after we first moved in. To align oneself with the real, while intimating that others are at play, approximate, or an imitation can feel good. But any fixed claim on realness, especially when it is tied to an identity, also has a finger in psychosis. Lacan wrote, if a man who thinks he is a king is mad, a king who thinks he is a king is no less so. Perhaps this is why psychologist D.W. Winnicott's notion of feeling real is so moving to me. One can aspire to feel real. One can help others to feel real. One can oneself feel real. A feeling Winnicott describes as the collected primary sensation of aliveness, the aliveness of the body's tissues and working of body functions, including the heart's action and breathing, all of which make spontaneous gesture possible. For Winnicott, feeling real is not reactive to external stimuli, nor is it an identity. It is a sensation that spreads. Among other things, feeling real makes one want to live. All right, skipping way forward, in his epic treatise, Bubbles, philosopher Peter Sloterdijk puts forth something he calls, quote, full of a negative gynecology, end quote. To truly understand the fetal and perinatal world, Sloterdijk writes, one must, quote, reject the temptation to extricate oneself from the affair with outside views of the mother-child relationship, where the concern is insight into such intimate connections. Outside observation is already the fundamental mistake, end quote. I applaud this involution, this cave research, this turn away from mastery and toward the immersive bubble of blood, amniotic fluid, voice, sonic bubble, and breath. I feel no urge to extricate myself from this bubble. But here is the catch. I cannot hold my baby at the same time as I write. Winnicott acknowledges that the demands of ordinary devotion can be frightening for some mothers who worry that giving themselves over to it will turn them into a vegetable. Poet Alice Notley raises the stakes. She writes, he is born and I am undone. Feel as if I will never be, was never born. Then 2 years later, I obliterate myself again, having another child. For 2 years, there is no me here. I have never felt that way, but I am an old mom. I had nearly 4 decades to become myself before experimenting with my obliteration. I've heard that back in the day, Rita Mae Brown once tried to convince fellow lesbians to abandon their children in order to join the movement. But generally speaking, even in the most radical feminist and/or lesbian separatist circles, there have always been children around. Sherry Moraga, Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, Karen Finley, Pussy Riot, the list could go on and on. Yet rather than fade away with the rise of queer parenthood of all stripes, the tired binary that places femininity, reproduction, and normativity on one side, and masculinity, sexuality, and queer resistance on the other, has lately reached a kind of apotheosis, often posing as a last desperate stand against homo and heteronormativity both. In his polemic No Future, Lee Edelman argues that, quote, queerness names the side of those not fighting for the children, the side outside of the consensus by which all politics must confirm the absolute value of reproductive futurism. Edelman writes, fuck the social order and the child. in whose name we're collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie. Fuck the waif from Les Mis. Fuck the poor innocent kid on the net. Fuck laws with both capital L's and small. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop. Or to use a queer artist friend's more succinct slogan, don't produce and don't reproduce. Now I know that Edelman is talking about the child with the capital C, not children, lowercase c, per se. And I know my artist friend is likely more concerned with jamming the capitalist status quo than with prohibiting the act of childbirth. I too feel like jamming a stick into someone's eye every time I hear protecting the children used as a rationale for all kinds of nefarious agendas, from arming kindergarten teachers to dropping a nuclear bomb on Iran, to gutting all social safety nets, to extracting and burning through what's left of the world's fossil fuel. But why bother fucking this child when we could be fucking the specific forces that mobilize and crouch behind its image? Reproductive futurism needs no more disciples. But basking in the punk allure of no future will not suffice either, as if all that's left to us to do is sit back and watch while the gratuitously wealthy and greedy shred our economy, our climate, and our planet, crowing all the while about how lucky the jealous roaches are to get the crumbs that fall from their banquet. Fuck them, I say. All right, I'll read two more sections here. 2011, the summer of our changing bodies. Me, 4 months pregnant, you 6 months on T. We pitched out in our inscrutable hormonal soup for Fort Lauderdale to stay for a week at the beachside Sheraton in monsoon season so that you could have top surgery by a good surgeon and recover. Less than 24 hours after we arrived, they were snapping a sterile green hat on your head, a party hat, the nice nurse said, and wheeling you away. While you were under the knife, I drank gritty hot chocolate in the waiting room and watched Diana Nyad try to swim from Florida to Cuba. She didn't make it that time, even in her shark cage, but you did. You emerged 4 hours later, hilariously zonked from the drugs, trying in vain to play the host while slipping in and out of consciousness. Your whole torso more tightly bound than you've ever managed yourself, a drain hanging off each side, 2 pouches that filled up over and over again with blood stuff the color of cherry Kool-Aid. To save money over the week, we cooked our food in the hotel bathroom on a hot plate. One day we drove to a sports chalet and bought a little tent to set up on the beach because the beachside cabanas cost too much money. While you slept, I ambled down to the beach and set up the tent and then tried to read Eve Sedgwick's A Dialogue on Love inside. But it was like a nylon sweat lodge in there, and neither I nor the 4-month-old fetus could tolerate it. I had started showing, which was delightful. Maybe there would be a baby. One night we splurged in our sober way and had $8 virgin strawberry daiquiris at the infinity pool, which was stocked with Europeans on cheap vacation packages. The air was hot and lavender with a night storm coming in. There was always a storm coming in. Frat brothers and sorority sisters thronged every fried fish joint on the boardwalk. The crowds were loud and repulsive and a little scary, but we were protected by our force field. On our 3rd day, we drove to the 2nd largest mall in the world and walked for hours, even though I was dizzy and exhausted from early pregnancy and the suffocating heat, and you were just barely over the lip of the Vicodin. At the mall, I went into motherhood maternity and tried on clothes with one of those gelatin strap-on bellies so that they have, so you can see what you'll look like as you grow big. Wearing the strap-on belly, I tried on a fuzzy white wool sweater with a bow at the sternum, the kind that makes your baby look like a present. I bought the sweater and I wore it all winter back at home. You bought some loungy Adidas pants that look hot on you. Over and over again, we emptied your drains into little Dixie cups and flushed the blood stuff down the hotel toilet. I've never loved you more than I did then, with your Kool-Aid drains, your bravery in going under the knife to live a better life, a life of wind on skin, your nodding off while propped up on a throne of hot hotel pillows so as not to disturb your stitches. The King's Sleep, we called it, in homage to our first pay-per-view purchase of the week, The King's Speech. Later, from our Sheraton Suite Sleeper TM bed, we ordered X-Men First Class. Afterward, we debated assimilation versus revolution. I am no cheerleader for assimilation per se, but in the movie, the assimilationists were advocating nonviolence and identification with the other in that bastardized Buddhist way that gets me every time. You expressed sympathy for the revolutionaries who argued, stay freaky and blow them up before they come for you, because no matter what they say, the truth is they want you dead, and you're fooling yourself if you think otherwise. This is indented from the movie. Professor, I can't stop thinking about the others out there, all those minds I touched. I could feel them, their isolation, their hopes, their ambitions. I tell you, we could start something incredible, Eric. We could help them. Eric, can we? Identification, that's how it starts. And it ends with being rounded up, experimented on, and eliminated. Professor, listen to me very carefully, my friend. Killing Shaw will not bring you peace. Eric, peace was never an option. We bantered good-naturedly, yet somehow we allowed ourselves to get polarized into a needless binary. That is what we both hate about fiction, or at least crappy fiction. It purports to provide occasions for thinking through complex issues, but really, it has predetermined the positions, stuffed a narrative full of false choices, and hooked you on them, rendering you less able to see out, to get out. While we talked, we said words like nonviolence, assimilation, threats to survival, preserving the radical. But when I think back on it now, I hear only the background buzz of our trying to explain something to each other, to ourselves, about our lived experiences thus far on this peeled, endangered planet. As is so often the case, the intensity of our need to be understood distorted our positions and backed us further into the cage. Do you want to be right, or do you want to connect? Ask couples, therapists everywhere. Deleuze and Parnay say, the aim is not to answer questions, it's to get out of it. All right, and very lastly, very short, you don't do labor. I was counseled several times before the baby came. Labor does you. This sounded good. I like physical experiences that involve surrender. I didn't know, however, very much about experiences that demand surrender, that run you over like a truck with no safe word to stop it. I was ready to scream, but labor turned out to be the quietest experience of my life. If all goes well, the baby will make it out alive, and so will you. Nonetheless, you will have touched death along the way. You will have realized that death will do you too, without fail and without mercy. It will do you, even if you don't believe it will do you, and it will do you in its own way. There has never been a human that it didn't. I guess I'm just waiting to die, your mother said, bemused and incredulous the last time we saw her, her skin so thin in her borrowed bed. People say women forget about the pain of labor due to some kind of God-given amnesia that keeps the species reproducing. That isn't quite right. After all, what does it mean for pain to be memorable? You're either in pain or you're not. And it isn't the pain that one forgets. It's the touching death part. As the baby might say to its mother, we might say to death, I forget you, but you remember me. I wonder if I'll recognize it when I see it again. All right.
Thank you, Maggie. That was amazing. That was actually a bunch of the quotes Prishani and I had already discussed.
Oh, wonderful, great.
Before, so we'll go back to this kind of false choices, the monopolization of the radical, queerness of pregnancy, all that. But if you don't mind, I would like to start with the very end of the book, because as Elena and I were telling you of life event, we had this encounter with your book when we were starting the research, and we came to this paragraph that almost ends the book, and that ended up in the title of the exhibition. So it kind of we couldn't grasp it entirely, but it kind of opened a threshold beyond the binary opposition between reproductive and productive work that mainly frames most of the discussion about care and mothering lately. So I would like, I'm just going to quote it really fast.
You want me to read it? I can read it if you want, or you can read it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like the don't produce and don't reproduce.
Sure, yeah. Don't produce and don't reproduce, my friend said. We've already heard, I just read about that, friend.
Yeah.
But really, there is no such thing as reproduction, only acts of production. No lack, only desiring machines. Deleuze Guattari say, flying anuses, speeding vaginas, there is no castration. When all the mythologies have been set aside, we can see that children or no children, there's another quote, the joke of evolution is that it is a teleology without a point, that we, like all animals, are a project that issues in nothing. But is there really such a thing as nothing, as nothingness? I don't know. I know we are still here, who knows for how long, ablaze with our care, its ongoing song.
Yeah, exactly. So this kind of enigmatic acts of production, like, as I said, ended up in the title of the show. And we have lingered on them since, especially like in the sense that care is not an accumulative work, and I quote you again, at some point you say, the mother of an adult child sees her work completed and undone at the same time, right? So of course we have decided what acts of production are for us, but we want to ask you exactly, like, what do you mean exactly by acts of production?
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no. Well, I mean, it could mean so many things. I mean, I imagine that you guys probably, maybe you talked about it more in like a Marxist sense. I mean, I think one of the things that a book like this does that like theory, like Marx or something, it does differently, is that it takes these terms and it actually, instead of trying to define them so that they circulate in like one understandable realm, it kind of tries to liberate them and have them like produce a lot of meaning, which might be why it feels confusing. Like, what do I mean by it? And I think that it means a lot of things. I mean, I think that in queer theory, there's a lot of concern with reproduction, not just reproduction, like giving birth to human beings, but reproducing bad structures, disciplinary structures around gender, sexuality, or other things that are harmful for the variety of people that actually exist. And I think that since this book is concerned with how to reproduce without reproducing those structures, while knowing one's going to, that kind of leads to me to questions about what kind of production, like what kind of production, not like producing, commodified objects for consumption, but in a kind of performative, I don't mean performative like on a stage, I mean like in a way of like what kinds of new things, new habits, new repetitions, new relationships, or just like you say, forms of love that evanesce, that forms of care that are produced and are labored, but then in some sense there's not a ledger sheet for them, where you're not adding up all you've done for me, which is a difficult thing that parents and children negotiate,
Yeah, for us it was we kind of like put it on the other side of the Stockholm syndrome situation, like how to get out of this situation that seemed really kind of like dark and oppressive in some way. And so this as you said, of course we thought about it, as you said, as these kind of acts that produce other ways of living, other ways of, like, in the mere act of the relationship with this new being that has come, with you, and like you producing these kind of new ways of like the possibility or the potency of, of having that possibility of creating new ways and new relationships and stuff. But I do like also that it still remains kind of like you can't grasp it exactly. I can't give you like a very precise example. It's just kind of like an intuition that could go on the other side, that could talk about the political possibilities of the experience of care, somehow, even if it's kind of like open in that way, right? I don't know if Prashant, if you want to say something about this, or should.
Yeah, I like the way that the idea of production comes together with desire through your use of Deleuze in that, in the idea of becoming. And I think that for me, well, that's what moved me in the story. And I think that also relates to your treatment of words and meaning, and the fluidity of meaning in terms of the words, but also that happens in the encounter between self and self, self and other, and the experience of mothering in the book through a relationship to also a transformation that you've read already, but I think you also speak about two human animals undergoing transformations beside each other, bearing each other, lose witness. In other words, we were aging. So in that idea of desiring production, I think there's that sense of always having a kind of conflicted relationship to how one is relating to that experience and others in that experience. But I also wanted to just ask, because I do think the Alejandra and Helena and our related conversations have taken us back to Marxist theory. And in an earlier discussion today, there was an interesting conversation raised by a group of feminist artists around the artistic product or the artistic production, and the conflict that they felt in producing the work of art. But they were also speaking about the experience of mothering and care, and what that opens up in terms of possibilities for other worlds, other senses of being, other ways of being, but that there's always a conflict because there's still the bringing of that act of production into a system of value in a capitalist world that makes it difficult to escape one's own position in terms of how one can be, if I'm making sense. But Alejandra, you might want to come back to that. You were in that conversation, I think, as well. And but I think what's also interesting in terms of the idea of love as it's presented or in the story is that it does open up possibilities through acts of care as acts of production, but without denying the need to confront conflict, to confront how one is seen and read by the world in spite of how one wants to be and act in that world.
So many things there. Did anyone solve anything at your earlier session about about making products in a capitalist system of value, or no, just kind of expressing their ambivalence and conflict around it? Yeah.
Ambivalence and conflict mainly. I mean, many of them have they were kind of like discussing between if they should if they wanted to understand the acts of care as labor or not, or if that was kind of like a trap, so that was something that I wanted to discuss also with you, this idea of avoiding false choices and traps. One of the things we struggled in the project was exactly that. We decided to use the word mothering instead of motherhood, to kind of like avoid an essentialist and biological approach, to the discussion of care, but at the same time we were interested in how not to like obliterate completely the radicality of the body goes through the pregnancy, so you talk about the end of opposition between queerness and procreation, that no one set of practices or relations has the monopoly of the so-called radical or the so-called normative. I'm quoting you here, of how it's the binary of normative transgressive that's unsustainable. And then that's just this quote that you have already read about the queerness, in the inherently queerness of pregnancy. And I was wondering a bit that, I mean, it's something that we struggle, how not to, can we have it both ways? Can we like open it up so we don't get, like sensualized and biologized and go into all the types of gender straps, of the gender traps as it is, but not obliterate the experience in itself, which I think is pretty radical as well. I mean, how to, I mean, you say, or is it just another disqualification of anything tied too closely to the female animal for the privileged term, in this case, non-conformity or radicality? I'm interested in that idea of how somehow, even in kind of like the radical spaces that are opening up, new spaces, also there's the other side where they kind of like monopolize that radical stage and leave other bodies behind,
I mean, I don't think these are like solvable questions, so to me it's helpful to take kind of take a step back from them and try and get like a a view of them where you're not kind of in their mud a little bit. And I guess two things come to mind. One, what you were saying, Prashani, about care. I think that conversation is often split between this kind of idea of like the work of caring for children or gestating or different things, like that all of this should be treated as labor and it should be paid, like it should be, that this is like it should be enter, this is a very old feminist conversation, should it enter the economy in that way, or is the thing that we should value so much about care is the parts of it that exceed economic valuing, which of course is complicated by the fact that a lot of people, arguably one of the most growing industries is care work. And so where you're able to give care for work, and then where care is demanded of you otherwise, that's not remunerated. So I think but in that conversation about like, I mean, I think Saidiya Hartman's been really good on this point. Like, I think trying to hold the complication of something being that perhaps we can get into terms of how it should be valued, while also valuing the parts of things about it that exceed, value. I think we can do that. And likewise, I think, I mean, this is a huge, what you're talking about, Alejandra, about the biology and essentialism. This is obviously like a huge third rail right now that is, I think, really tragically, ripping through and dividing a lot of feminist and queer people who can and should be allies. And I think that, I'll just give you one way that I've thought about it recently is, vis-a-vis, Julia Kristeva's, older essay at this point, Women's Time, where she talks about these phases of feminism, and she talks about one being about equality, rights gathering, the second phase being about difference, kind of maybe what you're talking about, like celebrating or understanding or attending to specificity of different experiences, bodily or otherwise. And then, the third is what she calls the metaphysical phase, where sexual difference will be revealed as a fraud, And I think what she says that I think is really important about these is that the difficulty is that all three things can be happening in parallel. We don't just all live in the equality, then we all move to the difference, then we move to the sexual difference as a fraud. Like they all are happening often at once. I think that they're all happening at once right now and really kind of accelerate in a kind of accelerated feeling. And I think that people who haven't spent as much time, say in the difference part or in the, sexual difference as fraud part, or in the equality part, will often feel like the place where they're most invested hasn't yet gotten enough airtime, because none of them have really gotten enough airtime, So I think to me, the step back of seeing that can give me more compassion about like the situation and also inspire me to let them all be animated in the present without feeling like decidability, like an imperative to nail down being in one would be. I don't know if this is helpful, but this has been helpful to me.
Sure, of course. And I think that happens in the book we were discussing also with Prashani, how it's kind of like the story of three bodies that are going with very intense transformation, like Harry's transformation, yours being pregnant, and then also Harry's mother's dying, kind of like all in the same time, like all these processes. I mean, we're all the time having these transformations, this idea of the body, the individual body that doesn't change. It's just like obviously.
And that's why the passage that Prashani that you read, I didn't read it because I was trying to save time, but when that whole long passage about being in Florida ends up with that passage, the line, in other words, we were aging, it was really important to me in this book to put, Susan Sontag has, I think, the famous line about like, we all have a passport to the land of the sick, we just don't know when we're going to use it or different things. I think COVID has made that very clear, but like, it was really important to me in this book that everybody in it, and this has actually borne itself out to be true in the, however long, 7 years since it was published and, probably 10 since it was written, all of our bodies and everything that we're going through and all of what we're, are all completely changed, from the moment of this book's writing. So you get to know that really well when you go around and, things that are treated like coherent identities, they're way stations, and we all may find ourselves in ones that we having identifications that were not even on our menu, when we began to sit down for dinner,
Yeah, I mean, a related question to the, the question related to that, I think comes up, if we're thinking care as opening up spaces for new possibilities, for thinking outside, beyond, in relation to what cannot be thought yet. And in relation to what we were saying earlier about also needing to think what constraint there is. And I hope you won't mind me referring to your more recent book. And earlier you said you actually started writing it on freedom for songs of constraint and care before the Argonauts, which is really interesting to me because I think there's a lot that runs, there are many threads that run through both books. In the Argonauts, there's a place where you're speaking about some of the difficulties that you start to have to confront with Harry. And you say, I just want you to feel free, I said in anger, disguised as compassion, compassion disguised as anger. Don't you get it yet? You yelled back. I will never feel as free as you do. I will never feel free as at home in the world. I will never feel as at home in my own skin. That's just the way it is and always will be. Well, then I feel sorry for you, I said, or maybe fine, but don't take me down with you. We knew something, maybe everything was about to give. We hoped it wouldn't be us. And I mean, to have that held up against, all of the possibility, all of the making of a relationship, relations in new ways. You then come back to, I think, in the new book, and you I hope I can find it. You really spoke about Saidiya Hartman. And what I'm getting at is so the constraint of the body itself and different bodies, yeah, even transforming bodies, you know, and how they reacted to, how we reacted to by the existing world, in spite of us wanting to change it. And you go to a quote from her where she says, you say, Saidiya Hartman describes the care provided by Black women from slavery to the full emancipation of wage labor as coerced and freely given. Mm-hmm. This poetic paradox means to acknowledge how much care has been extracted from Black women at their expense and how much they have continued to give regardless. You quote her, the forms of care, intimacy, and sustenance exploited by racial capitalism, most importantly, are not reducible to or exhausted by it, end quote. Hartman makes clear that this paradox is specific to the sexual and domestic labor of Black women and cannot be assimilated into the lexicon of the political, including that of the Black worker. Yet, coerced and freely given gestures towards a broader dynamic about care that deserves our attention. Mm-hmm. Caring and coercion often exist in a knot, with their extrication never simple, nor sometimes even possible. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting, I mean, both in the Argonauts, in the way that you relate to us, to that question, but then in, you know, in the new book and mm-hmm. your unsettling of given ideas of freedom, or meanings given to freedom. And I think that that's something that sits at the heart of this exhibition as well. You know, yeah. So
you're you haven't hammered it out, but by pulling out those two passages about the conversation with Harry and that part from Hartman, yes. I think is very wise. And I think, I mean, obviously the issues she's talking about are, you know, in profound excess of a fight in a relationship amongst two white people. But I will say that little line, like anger disguised as compassion, compassion disguised as anger, I think you can hear in that the scenes of my saying, I just want you to be free, is a kind of like, I care about you, you know, I just want this for you. And I think, you know, Sarah Ahmed has written a lot about this, about happiness. It's like our desires for each other have elements of control or coercion sometimes baked into them. I mean, in like Buddhist thought, you might think about it as just like the desire for anybody to do anything coming from you has aggression in it, you know, and that you want them to be different than they are. And I think that I was very, I mean, it's a little esoteric, but the chapter about drugs and addiction in the Freedom book is really concerned with that in terms of, because the question of how to care for people in active addiction, while also understanding that the decision to become sober is like, you know, it can be made much more unlikely by trying to coerce that person into sobriety. You know, it's a very interesting issue, you know, and I think we've also seen with the pandemic that this opposition of kind of freedom and care, like over here we care, we wear a mask, we don't want to hurt you, you know, and over there you're just free and you don't care about anybody else except for yourself. It hasn't exactly provided a grounds by which to make a kind of, you know, to have people find within them like the desire and capacity for collective care, like, and it's been very difficult. I think we've seen in a lot of real time, in a lot of painful ways, how hard that is, and how building the appetite and the desire for it is as important as, you know, mandates or whatnot, you know, and I think it's a very, very hard problem, you know.
But also it's kind of, the problem is kind of like this binary opposition again, it's always a problem of binary opposition between care and freedom, right? Like why not see act as a political care as care as a political act and not as a diminishment of freedom. But then that gets also kind of like problematized with some of the things that Prashani was saying, because for example, in Latin America, and I think it's the same in South Africa, we're thinking this whole economy of care gets very complicated because it's cheap labor as well. Care is cheap labor at the same time. So so are we gonna to understand care as a political radical act, but then we are kind of like, I don't know how you say, how do you say, like you like people that can are giving all the acts of care to people that are in very different conditions and kind of like more impoverished conditions, and that also stop them for actually having the possibility of caring for their own people. So then there's kind of like this level of discourse that is very interesting of us talking about, care about care being a radical act and all of this situation, but there's also this whole other level that even for us to be talking right now, someone else is taking care of my kid, at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that line that I read to you where I'm talking about Slaughterjig and about loving this bubble of being in there, and I say, but there's one problem, I can't hold my baby at the same time as I write, although I've tried, I'm sure we've all tried, and I certainly tried a lot during the pandemic, although he's too big to hold now, but definitely got weird. But yes, I mean, I think that's this problem that to emerge as a coherent citizen, in like the public square that conducts business, that does museum work, that, speaks to you guys on Zoom, the idea that other people are all encumbered in order to produce these citizens is, been true for thousands of years, in the form of slave labor and other things. And I think that, and certainly a lot of friends of mine in like disability studies and things, have written a lot about trying to make visible what it takes to produce the person in front of you, all the people that go into, producing the kind of mirage of an independent subject, but, I think we've also seen many times over, again, just the way that like you can't just flip it, that when people say, oh, well, wonderful, we'll just allow children to be everywhere more often, and it's fine, you can nurse while you teach your class or whatever. And it's like, our attention economy also cannot provide care to aesthetic projects, to other people, to literary project, to whatever the work is, and be providing it to one's child at the same exact moment. It's not, it just doesn't work that way. So there's problems.
Maggie, sorry, go ahead, Prashani, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think Helena wants to ask or come in. Helena? You there?
No, it was more like hi. No, if there was no questions of the public, but go ahead, Alejandra, just in case there were not.
I haven't been, they were going to send me some questions and they haven't sent me yet. And if you don't mind, I would like to go back a little bit to the body again, because I mean, I am currently 5 months pregnant, so that's why it's very much imbued into the body. Yeah, so I have a big belly, right? And I know many women don't like people touching their bellies, but I don't mind it at all. Like I like the connection. I kind of like invite it in. But writing your book, I can feel. My mother once told me like there's a superstition in Mexico that you have to let people touch your belly because in order to avoid el mal de ojo, which is the bad eye, kind of the envy or the bad sentiments that you could be, making other people feel by being pregnant, which was kind of strange for me. But I think it's not that. I never thought about it but that way, but if I'm honest, I kind of like use it as a strategy to interrupt a certain tension I feel with people, with me being, as you said, not one, but also two, you know, as you put it. And I wanted to quote you a little bit. You say at some point, perhaps because the soul in utero is pumping out static that disrupts our usual perception of another as a single other, the static of facing not one, but also two. And you connect this tension with an erotic and queer condition and of the pregnant body that really interested and also was important for us in the exhibition. You say at some point, but the pregnant body in public is also obscene. It radiates a kind of autoeroticism, an intimate relation in going on, one visible to others, but that decisively excludes them. So this kind of erotics of motherhood hasn't only been obliterated by patriarchal conservative forces, right? As you say as well, it has been politically important to feminists to kind of like underplay the erotics of childbearing in order to make space for erotics elsewhere. But I feel, as you said, of these phases of feminism that we've kind of like done that somehow, and now it's kind of like there's space for elaborating and emphasizing of these kind of erotics of childbearing and care. And I think that's very much into the book. And I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think are the implications, or what, you know, what comes to this emphasizing of the erotics of the experience?
Gosh, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I have a kind of riff in the Argonauts where I talk about like a baby book saying like, hey, you know, if you don't be panicked, if you get turned on while you're breastfeeding, like the same hormones are being discharged in your brain. And I kind of say like, well, you know, if the same thing is happening, like where is the part where we say this one is erotic and this one's not erotic, you know, like it's a very, and I do think that there's, I mean, this is very cliche, so I don't want to like feed into particular cliches that are probably not true for everybody, but I think that for people who gestated or and stay with their baby after birth and nurse, I mean, I do think that you know, many people have confided in me, and I've, you know, confided in them, this feeling that you know, the big secret is that like, of course everything falls away, because it's not only, I mean, it's not only enough, it's everything, and in fact it may be too much, but that everything kind of like, there can be a phase where like in a kind of sensory erotic you know, state, like kind of all you know, where it's just, it's everything, you know. And I think it doesn't, you know, last because it's particular probably to meeting an infant's needs, nor is it shared by everyone. I also have many people who've confided in me, you know, all kinds of feelings, postpartum revulsion, terror, needing to get away from the baby, you know, all kinds of things, you know. But I do think that you're right. I think that there's more space now of talking about different things, and also I think letting there be a variety of them instead of a one, you know, this is the normative way that this should go, makes also space for people to testify to more experiences, you know, more postpartum experience. You know. I mean, I will say, just when you said about reading that piece where I say it's like obscene because it's like an like erotic relation is going on, which the world is excluded. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting hearing that read back to me right after you talked about everyone touching, you know, and that there's a kind of like, oh, like we have to get rid of this mal de ojo, like this is like a community project, you know, that like everyone's feelings about the pregnant person matter, you know. I do think that both things, you know, again, maybe this is like the theme of the day, like both things seem true, like there's something radically intimate going on that for whatever reason many other people feel implicated in or stake their claim on, you know, in some way. And I think that you know, leads into other questions which actually probably link up with care work, which are like you know, many movements, revolutionary to conservative, have a narrative about the kind of like collective purpose of children, you know, like they are the future revolutionaries, or they're the future, you know, little league players, or they're the future, you know, whatever they are, you know, the future keepers of, you know, the family name, or, you know, whatever kind of, you know, back this kind of reproduction. And I think that questions about like this intimate experience the gestating person's having, coinciding with this kind of public claim. I mean, obviously, very obviously coming to a huge head with abortion politics, which my country is experiencing a real ride with right now. So, and I see there aren't questions yet, which is fine. We can just keep talking. So.
Yeah, I think they're gonna send me one, but I wanted to say, address to the people that are kind of listening, that we would like to open it up also for questions to whoever wants like to jump in. They just write it down and they send it to me, and we can ask the questions to Maggie or Prashani. So, but we can continue while, I mean, I wanted just to do that invitation to the public. I don't know, Prashani, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I wondered, I mean, something that comes up, I think, in relation to the last, and in relation to what we've been thinking together across South Africa, Mexico, in the context of this exhibition, in the context of COVID, and what comes before COVID, is living in uncertainty. And I think questions of uncertainty, unpredictability, undecidability run throughout the book. But I was touched by a particular part of the book where you say in relation to Iggy, and now I think I can say, I want you to know you were thought of as possible, never as certain, but always as possible. Not in any single moment, but over many months, even years of trying, of waiting, of calling, when in a love sometimes sure of itself, sometimes shaken by bewilderment and change, but always committed to the charge of ever-deepening understanding, two human animals, one of whom is blessedly neither male nor female, the other of whom is female, more or less, deeply, doggedly, wildly wanted you to be. And I think, you know, there's uncertainty in that particular passage, but there's uncertainty running throughout the book as I read it, except for one moment, which is around the pronouncement of Iggy's gender. And I'm trying to find it. Your reaction is also interesting. I mean, you say you don't, it doesn't last for long. Sorry, I'm going to find it.
This book is not easy to find things.
I can't find it right now. But I think that, you know, just that moment of finding out Iggy's gender as something certain or appears certain in that moment of being told. Your reaction to it, that doesn't last long. But in relation to what we've been speaking about then, also, you know, what Iggy is to become, or who Iggy is to become. And you're also reminded by Harry that I was born female. Look who I've become. I mean, I wish I could read your own words. You know, so, you know, does the experience of mothering care, the uncertainty that comes with it, the unpredictability that comes with it, and yet, you know, that certainty also that the world is going to see and recognize, and you're going to have to reckon with that, you know. So yeah, I want.
Yeah, it's funny, you know. I mean, as you can imagine, like some of my, you know, you know, some of my friends and maybe some, you know, not total friends, you know, have expressed desires for the book to, you know, wishing it had been even less certain in its, you know, like people have written about that scene and said, you know, wow, in such a queer book, like, why is she like just accepting that she's having a son? You know what I mean? And I think this is kind of back to what you're saying, Alejandra, about like, you know, what was certain is that, you know, that the you know, the genitals that are going to be, you know, attached to the child, that were the visible genitalia was a certainty, right? And I think part of allowing some things to be certain and then letting other things to stay in flux, you know, is part of the challenge, you know. And I think, you know, when you read a lot of parenting guides and stuff, you know, they'll forget gender. They'll tell you that's true all along, and that one of the most, you know, difficult things that is to resist, I think, as a parent, is to engage in this storytelling, like, you've always been the brave one, you know, your sister's always been the pretty one, you know, this kind of like, which actually I don't think comes out of a horrible place. I think it comes out of natural parental observation of, you know, discerning differences and discerning traits that have been there throughout. But these stories, especially when delivered from like authority figures, you know, become stories that we tell about ourselves. And so how to, I mean, I liked it, Prashani, when you kept talking about the Argonauts as like a story, because in some ways the Argonauts is a story that was told about like relations at a certain moment. And like I've said, it too, that remains not the only story, you know. And I think that's why, and this is back to what you said at the beginning, Prashani, about words and about certainty, you know, in some ways, you know, the book, the whole thing is explicitly framed by this, you know, kind of benign argument that my partner and I, you know, were having when we met about language and about words, and words being good enough, and articulation, and his experience of words as, you know, murderous, basically, to flow. Which doesn't mean, you know, a lot of people have thought, oh, that must mean Harry's a man of few words. Au contraire, like Harry uses tons of words in his art, and actually has written, see if I have it over here, like a, you know, wrote, like when everyone was like, write your own book if you don't like the Argonauts, he was like, I will. And so he wrote this book, My Meteorite, that came out during COVID. It's a really brilliant book, but like, you know, is a much, I mean, one paragraph of My Meteorite and you're gonna be like, oh, this guy's got, you know, I'm like a minimalist, you know, and Harry's like a real maximalist. All that said, this foregrounding of this argument about like words, and my feeling that my kind of less concern because of my feeling that, you know, my acceptance that words in and of themselves cannot, like nouns don't convey flow, but literary experience can, you know. And then the trick is like, how do you use all these words that are articulating things to make a feeling that's like greater than the sum of, you know, the sum of its parts. And you know, as a writer, that's not something you really control directly, you know. You can only do it, in my experience, by I try to be very clear and very specific. But like I said, I also try and make kind of fields in which, like the word production, like fields in which we've seen a word be enough things that we have had it flooded, not as like Eve Sedgwick would say, you know, more than one, more than two, but not infinite in meaning, you know, like it's not like an infinite amount of meaning that's been made, but it's multiple, you know, and you know, but these are very, you know, there's a certain amount of magic in like a literary book where you either conjure it or you don't. And then some readers will feel it, and some readers, it will always feel flat and not magical, you know, and that's like just the way it is, you know.
I actually received one question regarding about how your way to conjure, actually about your writing, right? So, you know, like talking about how to always like it matters what stories you use and how you write and etc. I mean, you have a particular way of writing that I think has been a key strategy to open your way to a very wide and also very demanding set of readers. No, so you like the intellectual the hierarchization brought about your use of quotes. You know how you use the quotes on the sides, and you talk about Preciado's author theory, Testo Junkie, as well as the reference. And in the book, you sometimes discuss it as writing as a trader, or relaxing. I really like this, relaxing in an orgy of specificity. I really like it, and being afraid of assertions. And I wanted to quote, yeah, just one phrase to say: in the face of such a phallocentric gravitas, I find myself drifting into a delinquent, anti-interpretative mood. In place of an hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. But even an erotics feels too heavy. I don't want an eros or an hermeneutics of my baby. Neither is dirty, neither is mirthful enough. So I think, I mean, I had thought about this question, but also from the public, they're asking about this way of writing and conjuring. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh gosh. Ugh, what to say? Like, you mean like? I mean, I guess, you know, I've written a lot of different kinds of books, and I think, you know, writing has similarities, but, you know, different books kind of demand from me different excursions and different citational practices, different fields of like where I'm hunting for ideas or study, you know, and yeah, so they're different. I mean, I teach writing too, you know, for a living. Like, I'm gonna teach right after I get off with you guys, and you know, I really like. I mean, I like teaching in that, like, I can see more clearly with other people sometimes, like that. You know, anything is kind of within reach for us, but we have all these obstacles, you know, in the way. And I think for me, writing is very much about clearing obstacles, you know, and feeling. I'm a kind of a private writer because my partner Harry is always joking with me that like I just won't tell anybody I'm writing a book for years until I can come out with it fully drafted. But that I think that's in part because it's like a very intense self-questioning and writing out a lot of thoughts about, you know, like the Argonauts and then on freedom, you know, they're, you know, a lot of them about like touchy subjects that I really don't know what I think until I spend a lot of time both researching and then writing sentences about them, you know, and then I only know what I think. Like the book is a truce with like what you found, you know. The book is like, here's the end of my thought, what do you think, you know, like it's not a, you know, I don't write you know, in a manifesto or you know, too dogmatic a style, you know. But so the question is then how to write in a non-dogmatic style, but that also doesn't frustrate or fall apart, so that the uncertainty, you know, Prashani, that you're talking about feels still palpable and specific in its way. It doesn't just feel like a muddle, like you couldn't make up your mind, you know. And that to me has a lot to do with specificity of language and you know, what Barth called like the neutral, like not just saying, oh, here's a paradox, but then kind of creating something. Maybe the whole book project is like the way out, you know, not any particular line in it, but the whole thing might give you the feeling, like I said in the Deleuze, you know, quote, like to get out of it, you know, like it might not be, that might not be accomplished on like a sentence by sentence basis, you know.
I have a question, really, it's really related to that, but I'm going to read it. It says, in the Argonauts, Maggie speaks also of her own writing process. In a section, she said that she's developed a faith into articulating. It seems to me that in the complexity and plurality of meaning and possibility in the acts of care and mothering and gender, the practice of articulating is a significant act. Can you talk more about it, please?
Yeah, you know, I think like a lot of writers, I tend to, maybe to my detriment, but maybe to the writing's benefit, like go at things that I feel maximally like scared by or uneasy about, you know, or worried over. And that bit that line comes out of in the Argonauts about I can't remember what you said, Alejandra, but like about just about writing into
articulating, right?
Yeah, the first part was just about, it was kind of about like a faith in articulation. So that part of the Argonauts is in the context of thinking back about 2 books I wrote about my mother's sister who was murdered. And those projects felt really nerve-wracking to me, just because like the killer was still at large, and I'm like going around to bookstores, and it just felt and then he was on trial, and then I was writing about it all had a lot of it had both its own fearfulness in the moment, but it also had the fearfulness of like my whole life of her murder loomed very large in my family. So my whole life, it was kind of like the idea of this killer, weighed heavily on me as a young woman, a young girl, and then to write books where I'm like in the courtroom with the accused, it was just like kind of a lot. So my point is that like, I think this faith and articulation, so in the context in the Argonauts, I'm talking about those books and I'm saying, well, this is scary, but I've at some point I just decided to kind of throw my bag in with like articulation as its own form of protection, and I think that it can, articulation can bring you, like it's brought me in my writing kind of further and further into trouble. It's certainly not like staying away from trouble, but maybe this is what the questioner was kind of getting at about articulation and in around mother or gendering. It is for me though a I don't know how to say this, but like I used to think that articulation would save you, like you wouldn't die or nothing bad would happen to you. Like if you were an outspoken woman, you would protect yourself. Now I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem to be so, but I'll go down talking, I'll go down speaking, like I'll go down writing. And that if I go down that way, and that to me, when I kind of realized that, I thought, oh, the goal isn't just to not be my aunt, and to do everything I can to ward off her fate. It's to like keep on talking until, because she called herself a gusher in her journals. It was very moving. And she wanted to be a civil rights attorney. She was the 6th woman to be enrolled in the University of Michigan Law School. And there's an award for her called the Jane Mixer Award for Social Justice for young people who want to take that route. And, her death really felt like in my family, like, oh, this is back in the 60s, they were like, oh, go down that path and look what happens to you, and so I felt like when I realized, oh, it's not protection, it's just living the way you want, that was meaningful to me. I feel like I'm taking this conversation in all kinds of directions that we were not planning on taking, but I'm just talking, so.
No, I think it's, I mean, for us, articulation has been vital. One of this whole project started because we kind of felt like we were part of a, when we gave birth, we felt like there was like this secret, the secret that we were part of a secret pact.
Yeah.
That all the women that had gone through this and hadn't talked about it, and we didn't have access to those voices. And this I think this is like a very, like I've talked, like I don't know if someone hasn't, but like everybody that I have talked to has that feeling that why didn't anybody tell me?
Yes, exactly.
It's going to be like this, So for us, the project is very much about articulating and And
Alejandra, I'm just curious, like, do you think, I mean, obviously, to some extent, the more that's articulated and shared and passed down, the more people know, right? Do you think that some of it is like, no one would believe you if they told you, like, kind of a thing? Or like, I'm just curious about like,
well, I think people, there's this thing about specifically, I think the pregnancy and mothering, that people think before going through it, you think people think it's not interesting enough, just not interesting enough, like people. And to be honest, Elena and I had talked about it. Like I don't think we would have done this show if we hadn't been mothers. And many of the artists of the show have been mothers in many different ways, not specifically giving birth. Not all of them, but most of them. It was hard to find someone that would work on this subject without going through the experience. And it hasn't been. I mean, we have also done shows on racism, and you have a lot of people that obviously are not in a situation to suffer racism, but go about it, talk about it. But I have found, I can't say this character, drastically, but I have found that people that haven't gone through it really don't want to. Are not interested in it. That is something that is culturally passed on to us. So it's kind of like, or it's like when you have a spontaneous abortion, for example. I had one, and I told my friends, and they all started, "Oh yeah, me too." What do you mean you too? Yeah, me too. And also the other one, and my aunts would say, "Oh, I lost 2 babies," and I said, like, why nobody talks about it? There's no. How did I didn't know about this? Like there's these moments. So, but I think it's exactly one of the things that we wanted to stop with this project, right?
Yeah, I mean, now we're back to also what we were talking about before, about the conversation you all had earlier today about value, and like what are the markers or signs that an experience has value? Is it like number of viewers that will come into museum? Like, is it, and then I think you're right. I mean, I do think that like with the Argonauts, I have had non-mothers say like, "Oh, your book really made me feel so glad. I'm not a mother. Like, it just sounds awful. Like that birth story is horrible." And I'm kind of like, the birth story is like as good as it could go, kind of, what I mean? But I think, but I try and have like compassion in the way that, I mean, like I said, I teach, and a lot of, not many. Occasionally I have some students who are mothers, but I have many who are not. And that subject position of like daughter, and the kind of like a student of mine said the other day, like, well, I just don't think I ever want to have a child, because in my family they always say once a mother, always a mother, and I was like, I don't know that they're saying that that's a bad thing, and she was like, well, I think sounds like a bad thing, you know what I mean? And I was like it's not, and I was like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's so much like staying in the subject position of like fearful daughter, which I totally inhabited. Like I was in that subject position for a long time, so I have compassion for it. And I don't know whether or not one has to caretake children to move out of it. I'm not really sure, What do you think, Prashani?
Well, I haven't given birth to children myself, but I do have 2 nephews who I'm very close to. But I mean, I don't have a lot to say on this. Maybe I could open it up to, if there aren't any other questions. I know Helena wanted to come in. Ale?
Yeah, they're asking me to kind of like close in, kind of like to do like closing remarks. So I don't know if you want to say something, Prashani or Maggie, or we can start. There are no more questions. Elena is here as well. She said we can start closing up because the time is kind of.
I'm curious about, I know we have to close up, so I shouldn't be asking you a question, and having not seen the show, but I am interested, like, I know that in the States, and and to me this is not new. Like, to me this was going on in the 70s too, but I feel like there's a kind of renewed interest in the bad mother, like a renewed interest in the mother who doesn't want to be a mother, kind of. I think with some of the popularity of like Elena Ferrante and then the making into a movie that Maggie Gyllenhaal made of The Lost Daughter. And anyway, I have a lot of, like I said, like a lot of students and people who I feel like they're very interested in the bad mother, like the infanticide mother, and I'm interested in that too. But like I said, it's interesting to me because I kind of felt like to me, I'm not as interested in it, only in I think just because in my personal life, I'm trying to be a good enough mother, and that takes so much labor that I'm like, oh God, like, which is of course haunted by the bad mother. Like that's always this problem, right? But I do think it signifies to me all that interest in it, that there's a lot that must still feel not said, and there's a lot that must feel novel to hear. And, I think maybe one of the reasons why I don't feel like, maybe ethically like as interested in it is that, I tend to work in nonfiction, and I think it's really different when people write fictively about children that they don't have and their feelings about them than when you write about feelings about your living children, which seems to me like still a pretty, not just taboo, but just ethically difficult arena, Anyway, those are just some thoughts. I wonder if that is a trend where you all are as well.
Yeah, it is as well. I mean, there's a lot of, especially in literature, there's a lot of very interesting fiction books regarding both sides, the bad mother, but also the dark side of motherhood. Maybe much more the dark side of motherhood in I feel like in Latin America and in Mexico. But I think that's another whole new world. Like we decided at some point there was an artist, a male artist that told us, oh, it's a great show, but if you ever do a show on the perspective of the son, the mother, call me, I have a lot of work. And I said, like, that's, yeah, you can do that.
That's art history, buddy.
Just go ahead and do it. Like, so we're not gonna do that. We're not gonna, if you want it, just do it. Yeah. I mean, actually, that's a whole other universe. And of course, we know that within the chain of violence, of course, the children are in the last stage. Of course, like we know that this whole oppression on motherhood, on mothering, ends up in most of the time translating to violence into the kids. But we were not at this point. The exhibition is very much focused on the perspective of the experience of the person who is carrying and the person who is mothering. So it's, yeah, we concentrated at this point because we were going through of course, but I think now we have to kind of like close it up. I don't know, Christiane, if you want to say something.
I wanted to say one little thing, because in South Africa, yes, there is the calling of the bad mother, the naming the bad mother, calling out to the bad mother. But there's also another experience of seeing young girls falling pregnant as bad, becoming mothers, being bad because of a relationship to a socioeconomic condition. So there's a social grant for children who are born to parents, interestingly, but it's usually mothers who apply for the grant, and there's actually a term, perverse incentives. So that's quite common as well, but that's a whole other story to be told.
I'm very compelled by. Did you guys read Jacqueline Rose's book on mothers for your? No, it's called Mothers: An Essay on Love and Cruelty. But I'm very compelled by her thesis in that book, which is essentially that. The sadism and idealization put towards mothers is, a symptom of asking them to fix, like lobbing on them as the kind of like all the results of the injustices in the world, and then because they're in the position of trying to. The question is like, did you or didn't you protect against these things, as opposed to turning your eye toward all the injustices and how they can be fixed, that reinvigorates over and over again a kind of idealization of the mother that protects and sadism towards the mother who does not, which in her opinion is totally misplaced. And I find that compelling. I tell myself that every day when I'm struggling, that
we have one of the works in the show is by Spanish artist Maria Ruido, and she's I think it's the most radical maybe a project in the show, and she's rethinking the figure of Medea. And she goes through a very specific case of infanticide that was very famous in Spain. But she goes through these reinterpretations of Medea, like saying this thing about Medea killing her children because she was jealous. It's just like the ultimate patriarchal fantasy. Like she was actually trying to just like recuperate her being human. She was just trying to be human again, and there was something that wasn't letting her be human, and it was motherhood in itself. So it's not related to it's not the sadism to the kids, but it's like the whole context, like loving your children but hating being a mother. So it's a very interesting piece. I can send it to you because it has English subtitles, and I think they could interest you in that way. But yeah, of course we can. It's very large, and I think it's interesting to go all the way, because I think we all have these kind of thoughts, even like violence, all these, paranoid thoughts about what can happen to the baby. There's also a whole this acknowledgement of the power you have over these little persons that depend on you, and there's a whole mental dimension there that is also not very much out there, and we should talk about it as well, very much.
Well, I wish that we were all in a room together and we could hang out and talk for a long time and hear more about your lives and the show and everything. But thank you for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to talk to you both, so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Maggie, for being here, and good luck in your class. And
thank you.
We'll be following your work, of course. And Prishani, thank you so much for staying up so late.
I know, it's midnight.
It was a pleasure. It really was. This was fun.
Please now go to.
All right, I'm gonna hope and trust we all meet someday. So I'm putting that out there. All right.
I hope so.
Okay, bye you guys.
Bye, y gracias a todos por acompañarnos, y mañana seguimos a las 10 con la jornada, con la conferencia de...
Thank you very much for being with us. So tomorrow we resume at 10 with a conference with Prishani and McGregor tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you. Bye.